So what exactly is espresso? Espresso is a small, made-to-order concentrated coffee consisting of liquid topped by foam or crema, dissolved solids, emulsified oils, suspended fines, and an effervescence of gas bubbles. What the heck does that mean? To cut out all the fluff, espresso is basically a concentrated form of coffee. You still extract it from the same coffee beans you'd make coffee from, but because of the concentration of the extraction process, you get the oils, solutes, fines that are going to be suspended and will eventually settle out if you leave it too long, and then also the gas that exists within the coffee. All of that combined gives you the dynamic of an espresso, with the color, with the striping, with the foam and the crema and all that stuff. So given the fact that you're using coffee beans that you would to make coffee, to make espresso as well, what are the things that make making espresso different? Well, this is one of two references that I'm using, if I haven't mentioned it already. The Professional Barista's Handbook by Scott Rayo. The other main physical reference I'm using is also from Scott Rayo. Now, the other reference I'm using, Espresso Extraction, Measurement and Mastery. This may or may not come out blurry. Now, this is also by Scott Rayo. It's only available in an ebook, and it's not that long. It's like 40 pages. Now, this goes into way more details. It talks about using a refractometer to see your extraction percentage and all that stuff. We're not going to get that detailed. But the reason I bring this book up is because when it talks about the ideal extraction, it talks about using four things: your dry dose, your extraction time, the temperature of the water, and your brewing ratio. Now, these will end up being common factors that we're going to be seeing throughout this series. How do I know that? Because everything that I've read has talked about these being the variables that you deal with when extracting espresso. And these are the things that you actually deal with that make espresso different from coffee, because you're using the same beans. Now, the one other resource that I've been using most frequently, along with these two books, is James Hoffmann's YouTube channel. Specifically, he did a series on sort of the basics of espresso, understanding each phase. And what I'm going to try to do is maybe go through those phases, but from the perspective of someone who's never ever done it before. Now, the thing that I've been sort of struggling with in my mind is the history of espresso seems to be very qualitative and not quantitative. People didn't measure things in the past. People just did it by feel and by eye. I was trying to juxtapose that in my mind with the whole sort of scientific and mathematical process that I've been learning about extracting espresso, and does that sort of sterilize the whole thing? And so I think using these parameters to get yourself within the ballpark of what could be a drinkable shot, and then fine-tuning after understanding what the variables do to your recipe to start dialing into a great shot. But ultimately, it does matter about taste. That's what every professional and every expert talks about. The taste that you get. You have to factor in certain quantitative things to get to that point. Speaking of taste, the first problem comes into play here. I've never tasted espresso. So as I mentioned earlier, ultimately it matters about how your espresso tastes. Because at the end of the day, if it tastes amazing, then that's what matters for you. But trying to get within that parameters when you have absolutely no idea where to start, obviously is going to cause issues. So you need some of these parameters to actually get into the right range. You know, one of the biggest challenges in me even starting this series, which I've had in my mind for about 9 months to do, was figuring out how to make this interesting. It's hard enough to make the process of 20 hours of learning anything interesting, at least for me. But it's even more difficult with something like this for two reasons. One, because there's a lot of reading and researching that you have to do, which I'm trying not to include within the 20 hours because I want it to be 20 hours of actually doing. But that leads to the second problem, in that it's kind of difficult without actually working as a barista. It's hard to accumulate 20 hours of making espresso and espresso-based drinks. Today, we're actually going to go to 3 different spots for espresso. The first is going to be Astoria Coffee in Astoria, which is where all of this started for me, where all the interest and where the acquired taste came from for me. The second place we're going to try is Say Coffee in Brooklyn. And the reason we're going to try this place is because it was apparently considered the best coffee in America in 2019. And the third place is going to be 4-5 Coffee in Manhasset. And this place we're trying because it was the only other place that I had come across that was almost identical taste to what I found in Astoria coffee. Why do YouTubers always put a camera in a corner and like speak into it like they're talking into a cave? This is stupid. All right, so here goes. First ever espresso shot. It's an acidic taste. It's like a citrusy, how do I describe it? I mean, if I'm thinking between sour versus bitter, this is weird. It's hard to describe something when you've never tasted it before. There is an element of like cocoa-ness to it. I guess that's not the craziest thing to think. There's something very characteristic about it that's like tangy or citrusy. I know I keep saying that. There's a word I'm looking for. It's almost like metallic in the back of the mouth. What I can say is I now, thinking about how lattes typically taste, I can now start to deconstruct in my mind how the espresso plays into it and how the milk expands that. It's almost like the difference between dark chocolate and milk chocolate. I don't know, I'm gonna let that sink in and we're gonna go to spot number 2. All right, so stop number 2 is 4-5 Coffee in Manhasset, New York. So, espresso number 2 of my life. Let's see how it goes. So this shot's similar to what I had at Astoria Coffee. There's a tanginess to it. It's not, certainly not bitter, but it's not completely sour. There's definitely almost like a dark chocolatiness to it in the way it hits the back of your throat. And it's that same level of sweetness that exists. As I'm drinking this, I'm starting to actually realize it changes the way you can taste espresso-based drinks. And I think the sort of creaminess and fat base of the milk mellows out the taste of the espresso and makes it a little bit more nutty. This is certainly not an expert's opinion because I don't know what I'm talking about. This is literally the second shot of espresso I've ever had. And I'm sort of trying to keep in mind the 3 sort of areas of extraction. The middle being that blend between sour and bitter, having that sweetness, while an over-extracted being described as bitter and an under-extracted being described as sour. If I had to pick between the 2, I would say this is closer to being sour, but there's also a level of the Maillard reaction that you can actually taste. Now, I should probably make clear at this point too that I'm not actually learning how to taste espresso because I'm interested in espresso, but I feel like it's important to understand the components that go into something like that in order to have the most informed taste buds to get to the point I want to get to. So things I've learned so far. 1, I don't know if I would ever be an espresso drinker. This stuff is strong. Is the camera in the right spot? It's so funny, like this is a good practice for me to figure out how to describe things on the fly because it's very difficult to explain. Both shots that I've tasted so far today have been tart. Tart is the word that I'm thinking of, not tangy. There's a tartness to it. There's a tart/sweetness. There's almost, if I had to use a word, there's almost a citrusy taste to it. And that's because it's acidic. And that's why I think I keep saying that if I were to categorize between sour and bitter, I would say it's more sour. It's not exactly sour, it's just tart. And there's definitely that chocolatey side to it, but it's not as creamy as I expected. And maybe that might sound ridiculous to you if you're an experienced espresso drinker. But when you see the crema on top and you see the thickness, the relative thickness of how it looks compared to the watery nature of coffee, you would expect a little bit of creaminess to it. And actually, you know what? The thing that it resembles the most to me is Turkish coffee. And that kind of makes sense because Turkish coffee has a lot more of the fines and the grounds in it. That's usually what settles to the bottom. It usually has that grittiness. But what I was saying earlier is it's interesting how it changes the way a latte tastes to me, because now I can characterize what part of a latte is the espresso part and what part is the milk's contribution to this whole thing. So I'm noticing the same dark chocolatey taste with this, and I'm also noticing that hint of tartness that I keep describing it as a metallic taste. I don't think it's a metallic taste, but it's the best way I can describe it. But this is way easier on the palate. The other 2 that I tried were a lot more pronounced. You can probably tell by the look on my face that it's not, the response is not as significant. In a good way, it's a bit more mellow. I think if I were to try this first, I don't think I would have called this sour right off the bat. Or I don't think I would have said it was leaning towards sour more than bitter. It's certainly not bitter. I think everything is more mild and mellow on this shot. Now, one of the things I didn't do, which I was initially kind of being suggested to do by some baristas and also was thinking about doing, was trying places that I know have good espresso-based drinks and then trying the espresso from places where I was like, oh my gosh, this is way off. But for two reasons, I didn't do that. The first is I think I'm very much capable of making my own terrible espresso shots. Thank you very much. And the other reason is because I don't want to be the person to call out other places that aren't very good, especially when I don't have a very experienced palate when it comes to this stuff. So who am I to even say that something is good or bad? But what I think I might do is I might actually spend a couple of other days exploring other places because it's just fun to go around. I mean, so far I've been within my own backyard, but it would be fun to see some other places and taste other types of espresso, do a little bit of research on the places that have been well known for certain types of espresso. The other thing that's really nice is just getting out here and asking if I could film in places got me 3 subscribers. To the 3 of you who did, thank you. And you know who you are.